Welcome back to Carneades.org. Today we're going to be taking a look at the cosmological argument for the existence of God. A quick caveat before we get going. This is a basic introduction to the cosmological argument. If you want more information, check out Summa Theologica by St. Thomas Aquinas or the cosmological argument in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. With that out of the way, let's get started. Now, there's a number of different versions of the cosmological argument that are out there. In this video series, I'm going to be focusing on two. The Thomistic argument, after St. Thomas Aquinas, and the column argument, often proposed by William Lane Craig and other such apologists. Once I propose these two arguments, I'm going to then follow those videos up with a number of objections that have been offered both by famous philosophers, and then I'll see if I can get in on the fun as well. The Thomistic argument is talking about the impossibility of an essentially ordered infinite regress, while the column argument more has to do with saying that a temporal regress is impossible because an actual infinite is impossible. It's okay if that didn't make any sense. That's why I'm going to explain them in some videos. So, first I want to give you a general sense, a kind of basic intuition of where any cosmological argument is coming from. Then we'll get into the specifics of St. Thomas Aquinas' version. So I always imagine this argument as the quintessentially obnoxious child argument. Not in anything against the argument, but rather because that's kind of the form that the argument takes. Anyone who's worked with children knows that at a certain point in their life, children are very, very curious about the way that the world works, and will start asking the question why, over and over and over again. The way that these conversations often go is, why are the leaves green? Well, because the trees need chlorophyll to produce energy. Well, why do they need chlorophyll to produce energy? Well, because the trees need energy to grow. Well, why do the trees need to grow? And so on and so forth. Usually these conversations end with something like, because I said so, or because God made it that way. Basically, if you were to phrase the cosmological argument in terms of the child's argument, it would go something like this. Either this conversation will go on forever, or there's something that cannot be explained. This conversation can't go on forever. The only thing that can't be explained is God, so God exists. Clearly this is an oversimplification, but hopefully it gives you a little bit of the intuition behind this argument. Now we're going to go from a very oversimplified version to a very complicated version, basically a paraphrasing of how the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy outlines St. Thomas Aquinas' argument. Let's take a look. Premise 1, a contingent being, a being that might not have existed, exists. Premise 2, this contingent being has a cause of its existence. Premise 3, the cause of its existence is something other than the contingent being itself. Premise 4, what causes or explains the existence of this contingent being must either be solely other contingent beings or include a necessary being. Premise 5, contingent beings alone cannot provide an adequate causal account of the existence of a contingent being. Premise 6, the cause of a contingent being must include necessary being. Therefore, a necessary being, God, exists. It's okay if that didn't make any sense. I'm going to go through and explain each of these premises one by one. So, first off, premise 1, a contingent being, a being that might not have existed, exists. Let's take, for example, your computer. There's a lot of other contingent beings. Basically, anything that's not God is a contingent being in one way or another. There's some possible world where your computer doesn't exist. All this premise is saying is, 1, that your computer exists, and 2, that it's contingent. That there's a possible world where your computer does not exist. Where you didn't buy a computer. You don't exist. Computers don't exist. The entire planet Earth doesn't exist. All of these things would be possible worlds where your computer doesn't exist. But in this possible world, your computer does exist, so it's contingent. Premise 2. This contingent being has a cause of its existence. Your computer didn't just pop into existence from nowhere. There was some thing that caused your computer to exist. Perhaps a computer factory. Maybe you believe in little elves in China that make computers magically appear, but they were the cause of your computer. Your computer didn't just suddenly come into existence for no reason. Something caused your computer to exist. Premise 3. The cause of its existence is something other than the contingent being itself. Basically, your computer didn't cause itself to exist. Your computer didn't somehow go back in time and make itself exist. Own grandfather. Check out the grandfather paradox if you're curious. It's a weird setup one way or another. Premise 4. What caused the existence of this contingent being must either be solely other contingent beings or include a necessary being. What this is saying is there's a lot of things that caused your computer to exist, first of all. It's not just the factory, but maybe the company that built the factory, and so on and so forth, kind of going back to that child's infinite regress. Well, what caused Apple, the company, to exist? Somebody named Steve Jobs. What caused Steve Jobs to exist? Well, his parents, blah, 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 going back, farther and farther and farther. The idea is either all of the things that go back in the causal history of your computer are contingent, that they might not have existed, or somewhere in that causal history there is a necessary being. Seems pretty self-explanatory. Now, contingent beings alone cannot provide an adequate causal account of the existence of a contingent being. This is where the real meat of the argument is. This premise does a lot of work for the argument. So, this is the child's infinite regress of y. If everything can be answered with something that is itself contingent, then we have a problem. We still haven't explained the whole. We haven't explained why there's something and not nothing. Why, in fact, your computer does exist. Why this world is the actual world. Basically, if you imagine it like, there are two possible worlds. There's a lot more possible worlds, but let's imagine two. One in which your computer exists, and one in which your computer doesn't exist. What made it so that the actual world is the world in which your computer existed? The only thing, according to this premise, would be some necessary being, some being that's not contingent, some being that exists in all possible worlds that picked this world to be the actual world. If something might not have existed, its existence cannot be solely proved by something else that might not have existed, because it would just go back in an infinite regress. The only way to do it is to have some necessary being at the end of the chain that started it all. The causes of a contingent being must include a necessary being. That just follows from the last two premises. Therefore, a necessary being exists, and necessary being in a lot of theologians' minds is just equivalent to God. Don't worry, we'll talk about that in one of the coming objections. So, the question here at the very base of it is, if everything is contingent, why is there something and not nothing? Why is this world the actual world, and not some other world? Why are things one way instead of another? Why does your computer exist, and why is it that the world in which your computer does not exist has not been actualized? Why is that world not chosen? The only explanation that the argument can offer is because a necessary being, God, made it so. I'll leave you with a quote from a child. Why? It's the most important question anyone has ever asked. Watch this video and more at Carneades.org, and stay skeptical, everybody.